In today's episode, I'm going to be sharing with you my DJI Mini 4 Pro settings in order to get the absolute best looking footage out of this drone. So starting off, we're gonna open up the DJI Fly app, and then from there, we're gonna go to the bottom right corner of the screen, and it's gonna have a little camera symbol with the words auto in it. Press that in order to open up the Pro features. This is gonna give you more control of the different camera settings in order to get the best possible footage coming out of your DJI Mini 4 Pro. So first, we're gonna click white balance. And in the top right corner, you can click auto. The DJI Mini 4 Pro has pretty good auto white balance, but I personally like to be in full control of what the white balance is. And essentially when it comes to white balance, we want to make sure that the footage is not looking too cold or too warm. Now, for a general rule, if you're filming in the middle of the day with the daylight, you're going to want to be anywhere from 5,000 to 5,600 Kelvin. Whereas then if it's really cloudy or shady, you're going to want to go up all the way from maybe 6,000 to 6,500. And then if you're filming more in the evening with fluorescent lighting, you're going to want to be at ISO 3200. Now, right now, my DJI Mini 4 Pro is just pointed out my window outside, and it's a pretty moody, cloudy day today. And at 4,800 Kelvin, it looks very blue. And I'm gonna bring it up to maybe 6,500 Kelvin. And already that looks a lot better. Now, I personally like my footage to be a little bit warmer. And now there's a little bit of preference. Some people might want a little bit more cooler. Some people like a little bit warmer. Some people like very neutral. So this is up to you. From there, then we're gonna pick 4K in order to get the most high quality. And then I'm gonna choose 25 frames per second because I live in Europe. The difference between 24 and 25 is basically 24 frames per second is for people in North America and 25 frames per second is for people in Europe. And that has to do with the lighting, flickering, and this kind of stuff. So rule of thumb, North America, 24, Europe, 25 frames per second. Now, some people like to film in 30 frames per second. I personally don't. Some people like that because it has a little bit more smooth look to it, but in my opinion, 25 frames per second has that nice cinematic motion blur, and it's the most natural to your eyes. So I like to stick with 25 frames per second. When you're filming at 25 frames per second, it's for normal speed, but then if you want slow motion, here in Europe, I would use 50 frames per second or the 100 frames per second. If you're in North America, you would use 60 frames per second or the 100 frames per second that's available. So I'm not filming right now in slow motion, so I'm gonna stick to 25 frames per second. Then for color, I'm gonna go from normal to D-Log M, which is gonna give you that nice flat picture profile. And essentially, this is gonna allow you to get the most amount of highlights and shadows in your footage, and as well as gonna give you that blank canvas for you to grade the footage in the direction that you want. If you film it at normal, it's gonna have a certain picture profile baked into it, meaning it has a certain amount of contrast, saturation, sharpness put into the footage already, and it's really hard to go from there and color grade. Whereas with D-Log M, it's gonna give you that nice flat picture profile. And in order to help you just to see what is the exposure looking like, what's the white balance looking like, make sure you have this color display assist on. Essentially, it just adds that contrast and saturation back for you to see. Whereas if you turn it off, it looks very gray and flat, and it could be hard to see what is your exposure like and what is the white balance like. Very nice feature in the DJI Mini 4 Pro because I know in older models, it didn't have this color display assist. So make sure that's on. Now for some people, filming in D-Log M can feel a bit overwhelming, and you might have this feeling like, what do I do with the footage now? How do I get it back to a normal look? And it's actually really easy. DJI actually offers their own D-Log M to Rec 709 conversion LUT, which basically just means you add this one LUT to the footage, like I'm doing right now in Final Cut Pro. You add a custom LUT, select D-Log M to Rec 709, and voila, in one click, it's back to normal. It's added that normal amount of contrast and saturation back into your footage. And then from there, you can color grade by adding another grading LUT. So for example, I love using my Cinema LUT collection. So I would add another custom LUT to the clip. And then from there, choose one of my grading LUTs, bring down the strength from maybe 100% to anywhere from 60 to 70%. And we've got great looking footage coming straight out of the DJI Mini 4 Pro. Okay, now we're gonna jump over to our camera settings. Here, I want to have the ISO as low as possible. If you're filming outside in the daylight, you're not going to want to crank up your ISO because you don't need more light. Now, if you are filming in the evening and there's less light, then of course you're going to want to crank up your ISO, but be mindful of that because the higher you crank up your ISO, the more noise you're going to introduce into your footage. Essentially, that just means that the footage is just not looking as high quality anymore. I did notice though in the Mini 4 Pro with the new dual native ISO fusion, I think that's called, you can actually crank up the ISO pretty high. I was filming at 1600 or 3200 and it still looked pretty good. Whereas in previous models of the DJI Mini 3 Pro even, I was not able to crank the ISO very high because it would get really noisy and bad quality quick. So that's a nice feature of the Mini 4 Pro. Next, for shutter speed, we're gonna take that off auto as well, and we're gonna wanna bring it down to 1/50th of a shutter. And the reason for that is this is the 180 shutter rule. So basically, if I'm filming at 25 frames per second, then my shutter speed should be at 1/50th. The same if I'm filming 50 frames per second, then the shutter speed should be at 100, and at 100 frames per second, my shutter speed should be at 200. The reason why you do this is that it would give a nice amount of motion blur for your shots. For example, if I'm filming right now with a 1/50th over shutter speed, you're gonna notice a nice amount of motion blur with my hand. Whereas if I crank up the shutter speed a lot higher and then I swing over my hand like this, you're gonna notice there's no motion blur in my hand. And to the human eye, that just doesn't look normal. Our normal human eye sees motion blur, so you wanna have that same kind of motion blur in your footage. So remember always, whatever your frame rate is, double the shutter speed. So 25 frames per second, shutter 50. 50 frames per second, shutter 100. 100 frames per second, shutter 200. Now at this point, you're probably thinking, Tepo, your footage on the Mini 4 Pro is very overexposed right now when you're doubling the shutter. And that's where ND filters come into play. This is this crazy pack from Freewell where they have a whole bunch of different ND filters of different strengths. And essentially, ND filters are just like sunglasses for your camera. So if you're outside and it's a very sunny day, you put on sunglasses so it doesn't feel as bright. And the same thing is with these little filters. You can take the filter off your DJI Mini 4 Pro and then you can put one of these ND filters to make it darker. So you're gonna wanna add an ND filter onto your Mini 4 Pro in order to bring the exposure down so you can keep that 180 shutter rule. Sounds complicated, but really simple in the end. You just throw one of these ND filters onto your Mini 4 Pro and voila, you're good to go. Me personally, I often find myself using an ND 32 or 64 on a sunny day, and then on a more cloudy day, maybe like an ND 8 or 16. So yeah, those are the camera settings that I'm using when I'm filming with my Mini 4 Pro to get the absolute best looking footage out of your drone. But what about flying? I think one tip that I would give for most people flying a drone is that they often fly too fast and the movements are way too crazy. And one setting that you can turn on your controller is to go from sport mode or normal to cinematic mode. Cinematic mode is gonna affect the speed of your drone and your ability to move the camera angles and such, making it feel a lot more cinematic and smooth rather than very jerky, fast movements. So I would recommend, if you want to get nice cinematic shots, use cinematic mode. It's going to make it a whole lot easier for you. So there you go. These are my settings for the DJI Mini 4 Pro in order to get the absolute best footage coming out of this small but very powerful drone. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe because I'd love to have you here for future videos. All right, have a fantastic day.